Once Upon a Time by Tom McRae. Don't think because these eyes are old I cannot see you. Yes, you, talking at the back, half hiding in shadows. If you wish to hear this tale, young man, you will stop your mouth, open your ears, and move closer to the fire. That's better. I can see you now. How young you are. I remember a story about a little boy just your age. Would you like to hear it? It is a dark tale, a frightening fable. Perhaps you would be too scared. Perhaps it would give you nightmares. Or are you brave enough to hear my story? You are? Are you sure? Good. Then listen, and I will begin. Once upon a time, many, many years ago, the children of our village started to vanish. At first it was only a few, a boy here, a girl there, maybe lost to wolves or bears or outlaws in the mountains. But after a time the adults started to notice. Too many of their children were not coming home. By summer, half the children of the village were missing. By autumn, there were but 24 left. By winter, only 2 children remained, a boy and a girl. The boy's name was Bryn, and the girl's name was Lisa. They were the last children in the village. Bryn was about your age, my young friend. In fact, he looked a little like you, all clever eyes and clever tongue with busy fingers. Lisa looked a little like you, my dear, the girl at the back with the dark eyes full of secrets. Yes, you remind me of her. She was a clever girl and knew her own mind well, which is more than most of us ever will. Would you like to know what happened to them? Are you brave enough to know the truth? You are? Then I'll continue. Bryn and Lisa had been friends for many years, and had spent many long nights telling tall stories over low fires. Bryn especially had the gift of the storyteller, and he loved the old legends, both hearing of them and the telling. Bryn would weave wild tales for Lisa's delight, tales of princes and castles and dragons and knights and strange curses and dark prophecies. Bryn loved those stories more than life. When he told Lisa about the brave knights on horseback, he always thought of himself. In Bryn's own mind, he was that brave knight, fighting for good. In Bryn's own mind, Lisa was the beautiful princess, needing to be rescued from evil with a kiss. And so, in the little village in the shadow of that great mountain, Bryn and Lisa grew happily together, finding enough time between jobs and tasks to run away and play in the forests and the streams and enjoy all the things that are good in a child's life. They were perfectly content. Until the music started. Lisa thought it came from the mountain, but it was almost impossible to be sure. When the music started, as it did every day, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Like a half-remembered song in the back of your mind, the notes and cadences trickled through the village, drifting in and out of hearing. But the strangest thing about the music that filled the village was this, my young friends. Adults could not hear it. Only the children such as yourselves, were able to discern the strange melodies that slowly and subtly invaded their homes. At first, none of the parents believed the children's tales of the wordless song. But after a while, once every child was telling the same story, the parents and the elders came to understand that a kind of music was playing which only the young could hear. They called it strange. They called it magic. But they did not try to understand it. And shortly after that, their children began to disappear. Every day when the music finished, there was one child less. Stories spread quickly that the missing children had been lured away by the music, lured away to the mountain and to their deaths. A child would go to the river to collect water, or to the forest to collect kindling, or run through the meadow chasing butterflies, and never be seen again. The other children would cross themselves and say, "He followed the music." Soon the children made a game of it. They would dare themselves to see who would go closest to the mountain, who could get nearest to the foot of the path that led up the mountain's side before their courage would break, and they would run screaming back to their group, their fingers jammed into their ears. For a while, it had almost seemed fun, until every child had followed the music, and only Bryn and Lisa were left. Their parents guarded them jealously from the world, locking them in their rooms and keeping them under constant watch. Bryn and Lisa, who heard the music at least once a day, usually in the evening, started to fear for their own lives. And so, when the music came, they would tell each other stories, and the telling of stories seemed to push all thoughts of the music from their minds, and so they were never tempted to follow it. Through storytelling, the last children in the village stayed safe. And through that same storytelling, Bryn and Lisa tried to make sense of what was happening to them and their village. Bryn and Lisa remembered an old story about a piper who enchanted the children of a faraway town, leading them away from their homes as revenge on the corrupt mayor. But neither Lisa nor Bryn were able to see a piper in their village, and the music did not sound like pipes. And so they came to the opinion that the story of the piper did not explain what was happening to them. Then Bryn and Lisa started to remember other stories. There were tales told by sailors of the sirens of the sea, cruel creatures, half woman, half fish, who sang a song no man could resist. The sirens would lure unwary mariners onto the rocks and unto their deaths. But the song of the siren could be heard by grown-up men, and the music from the mountain could not. So Bryn and Lisa were of the opinion that sirens were not the cause of the disappearing children. There were other stories, less well-formed than those of the piper and the sirens, which spoke of hauntings and curses and the howls of ghosts and banshees. But Bryn and Lisa were clever children, and they couldn't help but wonder, if there was an ancient curse in the mountain, why had they not heard of it before? Could it be that whatever was happening to the children of the village was, in fact, something new? For if it was new, then no amount of stories would be any use in the understanding of it. Possibly, given time, Bryn and Lisa would have come to understand the truth of the music of the mountain, but sad to say, time was not their friend. For one morning, Bryn awoke from his slumbers to hear terrible news. Lisa had disappeared in the night. Finally, it seemed, she had followed the music into the mountain. Bryn was left alone, the last child in the village. Now, my young friends, what would you have done if you had stood in Bryn's shoes? Would have waited for the music to come for you? Or would you have formed a different plan, a braver plan? Would you have been like the knights of Bryn's stories and ridden off towards danger, courage in your heart and fire in your eyes? Or would you have stayed at home, hidden under the covers and hoped for the best? Bryn's story is the story of a child who chose courage. That night, Bryn told himself a tale. In that tale, Bryn was not a little boy. Bryn was a shining knight, and Lisa his damsel in distress, stolen away by an evil power and hidden beneath the mountain to be awoken by love's first kiss. Bryn told himself that story until he believed it. Then he packed a bag and left the village. The path up the mountain was steep. Every speck of sense in Bryn's head screamed at him to turn around and go home. But Bryn stared firmly ahead, placing one foot in front of the other, one foot in front of the other. Then he heard the music. Louder now, as if he were closer to the source, and for the first time Bryn let his mind open wide and allowed the music to flood in without limit. The melody filled his mind, squeezing out all other thoughts, and Bryn came to understand what a sad song it was, the saddest he had ever heard. All he wanted was to find the maker of the lonely music and comfort them. But Bryn stopped himself from running off there and then. He was too wise to believe a song's sorrow, and felt it was a trick. And so Bryn began to tell himself a story. The story was of a wandering wizard with a magic wand who conquered evil in every dark corner he found it. Bryn let the story fill his head until it pushed the music out, and he was free to keep walking at his own pace. But now Bryn understood something. Whatever was making the music, whatever it was that had called the children away from the village, that thing was tired and scared and alone. That thing needed Bryn to be complete. Bryn reached the top of the mountain path, aching and sweating and fearful. A cave opened its dark mouth wide in front of him, and Bryn could feel from the pricking on the back of his neck that the source of the music was within. Bryn crossed his fingers for luck, took a deep breath, and took one step forward. Then he heard another sound, a gusting, grinding noise that rose and fell like old winds grating across one another. In the distance, a blue light sparkled and sparkled like a fallen star, before all was silent and dark once more. Bryn's heart was beating so fast he felt as if his shirt would rip in two across his chest, and as he stood still, his ears and eyes scanning the night, a man in strange clothes stepped out from between the trees and waved and smiled and said, "Hello." Bryn, who was not expecting such an apparition, waved and smiled and said, "Hello, back." The man looked at the cave, then looked at Bryn, then asked Bryn if he could hear the music. Bryn was surprised, for this man in strange clothes was as old as his own parents, and yet he could hear the music which all other adults were deaf to. And so Bryn nodded and said, "Yes." Then the man began to speak about all manner of strange things, and with the most unusual turn of phrase. He spoke so quickly and so oddly that Bryn was able to understand only that the man's name was Doctor, and that he was responding to some sort of magic which he called a distress call. Bryn, who was familiar with the stories of damsels in distress, felt he at least half understood that which Doctor referred to. Bryn wanted to ask more, but his tongue froze in stunned silence as he saw Doctor reach into a pocket and produce a magic wand. It was made of silver, with a bright blue light at its tip, like a star in a bottle. Bryn's heart jumped with excitement. All his life he had dreamed of the moment when he would find himself in the presence of an actual magician. But the wizard called Doctor was less interested in casting spells and more interested in pointing his magic wand at Bryn's ear. The wizard cast his magic into Bryn's head, and although Bryn could hear nothing more than a buzzing, like a fly caught in a jar, the wizard seemed to be able to read the strange signals and make some sense of them. "I see," said the wizard, but Bryn could not see what it was that he did. Then the wizard asked Bryn to follow him into the cave. Bryn, who was scared, warned the wizard that such an act was of the greatest danger, but the wizard, whose smile and swagger were unlike any Bryn had ever seen, just smiled wider and swaggered wilder and said, "Fantastic!" And so Bryn and the wizard entered the cave. Now, my young friends, the manner in which the wizard spoke was strange indeed, and he used many words which Bryn did not understand, but I will try to retell as best I can the language he used and the knowledge he imparted. First the wizard asked how long the mountain had looked down on the village. Bryn was surprised by the question and answered, "Always." And the wizard said, Next the wizard asked why the mountain was made of metal, not stone, to which Bryn answered, "Because it is, and always has been." And the wizard said, Bryn asked the wizard if he could hear the music. The wizard looked Bryn straight in the eye. "Yes," he said, "and it isn't music." The wizard turned and pointed his wand at the back wall of the cave. "Come to that," said the wizard, "this isn't a mountain either." And with a creaking and a scraping, the wall split in two and slid open as if by magic. Bryn looked within and gasped. "See," said the wizard, "it's a ship of metal and glass that sails, not the seas but the stars. But it's missing something it needs, and it's lonely, and so it called you." Inside the mountain the walls glowed and hummed with lights, and Bryn could see quite clearly. Lined up in rows were all the children of the village. A great magic had been cast upon them, so that they appeared as if made into statues. Every child was frozen in time, and laced across their stone-still skin were fine wires of silver and gold that blinked and winked with tiny lights. "Circuits," said the wizard, invoking what Bryn could only assume to be a magic word. Bryn and the wizard walked between the rows of statues, each face so perfectly preserved and so deathly still. Bryn felt his eyes sting with tears when he saw Lisa, frozen among them. He tried to shake her, but she was rigid and unyielding. He tried to call her name, but she was deaf and blind to him. "She can't hear you," said the wizard. "None of them can." The wizard was staring at Lisa, stroking her with his magic wand. There was a long silence before the wizard said, Then he blinked, coughed, and told Bryn a story. "Once upon a time, long ago," began the wizard, "a great starship sailed the skies. So great was the ship in its design, it was gifted with its own intelligence, its own metal mind. The ship delighted in its power to think and to know, but had one great sorrow. For all its cleverness, it was unable to imagine. For above all things, the ship craved not computation and calculation, but fiction and fantasy. The ship wished to understand stories. The crew of the ship understood stories and would spend long hours in the telling of them. The ship listened to their tales and loved every word, but never truly understood their meaning. Then one day a sickness befell the crew, and after a little while they died. And so there was no one left to tell stories for the ship to overhear, and the ship was left alone. And so the ship decided to find new people to keep it company and tell it tales. It searched the sky for many years before finally it found this world and fell to earth. Where the ship landed, a river burst loose from the earth, and so after a long, long time, people came to settle near the ship and the river, and believed the ship to be a mountain. The ship was happy to have company and watched its village grow and grow. More and more children were born, and in each child's mind the ship installed a little part of its own programming, a tiny electric spark in the back of each human brain. Through these sparks, the ship was able to hear the thoughts and words and dreams of its people. Over the centuries, the village thrived and grew, and people told each other their stories, passed on from father to son and mother to daughter. The ship loved to listen to these tales, and with each passing year it began to understand the stories a little better. Slowly the ship started to learn what excitement and fear and laughter and suspense were. The ship started to understand what was meant by once upon a time and happily ever after. And so, after a while, the ship began to crave its own happy ending. The ship knew it would never return home. Its engines and sails had been too badly damaged when it fell to earth, and after many centuries of silent observation, the ship came to understand that it was dying. This did not sadden the ship, which was happy to die in its new home, but it did have one regret. It wished that, just for once in its long life, it was able to tell a tale rather than merely listen to one. The ship wished to do the impossible. Its mind was made of maths and metal, and yet it wanted to write a story. And so the ship had an idea. Using the spark it had buried in the head of every villager, it called the children to it, for children are the greatest storytellers. The ship embraced each child, hugging it tight in the fabric of its being, coating it in circuitry and fascination. Each mind was connected to form an organic matrix, a machine of flesh and blood and soul designed for one purpose: to enable the ship to create its great story. But one part of the matrix was missing, the most important part: the mind of the best storyteller in the village. And at this point, the wizard paused and looked at Bryn. "Your mind, Bryn," the wizard said. "I heard the ship calling to you, calling so hard the signal reached me as a distress call. The ship needs you. It doesn't understand that it was wrong to take you and your friends against your will. For all its age, it is like a child. It does not mean to be bad." Bryn thought hard on the wizard's words. Then he looked up. "The mountain, the ship, it needs me to finish its story?" The wizard nodded. "But I don't know what the story is," said Bryn. "I don't know how it started or how it continued." "Yes, you do. The story is the story of your village and of your life. It's the story of people, ordinary people, not knights or dragons or kings in castles. It's the best sort of story. But we're real. We're not things made up in the telling. You're real to yourselves, but to the ship, you are just characters in a tale. But the ship is dying, and it needs you to tell it how its story ends." Bryn looked round the frozen children and thought hard. Then he decided. "Where is the ship?" asked Bryn. "Everywhere," answered the wizard. "All around you." Bryn nodded and raised his head to address the ship. "After the children were taken from the village by the wordless song, Bryn the brave and magnificent," the wizard coughed and stared at Bryn. "I mean," said Bryn the nice and normal, climbed to the top of the mountain and entered the mouth of the cave, and found the ranks of frozen children. And among the lines of lifeless faces was the face of his one true love, the beautiful, clever Lisa." And Bryn strode over to Lisa and stroked her face. "And then," continued Bryn leaned towards her, and as Bryn told the story, he leaned in close to Lisa, so that he could smell her hair and her skin, and kissed her. And Bryn kissed Lisa so gently on the lips, and everyone woke up. And as Bryn stood back, the story was completed. Lisa blinked and opened her eyes as the lines of silver traced away from her skin and life returned to her body. Every child in every row stretched and yawned and awoke as if they had been asleep for a year and a day. The lights in the walls around them began to dim, slowly, slowly, until there was almost nothing left. "The ship is dying," said the wizard, "and it's happy." The wizard looked at the waking children, every one of them freed by Bryn's story, every face smiling and alive. And finally the wizard's eyes settled on Bryn and Lisa. "The end," he said. "Now, my young friends, the tale is over. Now, don't all shout at once. There are many other tales of the wizard called Doctor, but those are best left for another night. What happened to Bryn? Why, he lived happily ever after, of course. What happened to Lisa? Why, she lived happily ever after too. Did they ever marry? Well, that would be telling. How do I know what happened in the mountain? Why, because I do. Enough is enough, and it's past bedtime for all of us. Let an old man and his wife have their house back to themselves. And maybe there's a piece of cake for you if you sneak out quietly. Yes, here is my wife now, and she has cake for you all. Thank you, my love. Yes, the story went well, and your cake looks delicious. Upon my word. But they get greedier every year, don't they, Lisa?